Okay, this is a short video to finish up the Descartes reading real quick to take you through the rest of the um, paragraphs here in the principles. We just looked through the first 7 or so of them. Just to remind you, the main thing, what I would recommend is before you even really get any deeper into reading these paragraphs, you should go through and just read all the titles of the paragraphs. Now, you'll recall that Descartes talks in the introduction about how important the order is. So these paragraph headings present in order the topics that he's covering and provide the argument in the proper order in order for you to understand it. Remember, the order is important because Descartes' system is a deductive system, so he wants to find a first principle. The early paragraphs have to do with the methodology by which he discovers the first principle. Of course, the first principle itself is, I think, therefore I am. That is found first in paragraph 7. Before that, he made some important comments. The first is this methodological use of doubt, that we should once in our life doubt everything. The point of doubting is, of course, as I explained before, so that we can discover something that is indubitable. So only by doubting all things and subjecting them to the strongest possible doubt, seeing if we can come up with any kind of scenario in which they may, or even imagine, we could even imagine that we would be incorrect about them. If we can do that, then they are not certain, and so can be subject to doubt. And therefore, in a theoretical respect, not in a practical respect, should be rejected until we find the correct first principle. That thing will be something that is indubitable, meaning as soon as we think it and we attempt to doubt it, something in that doubt is self-refuting. We have to assert it even in order to doubt it. So the doubt isn't authentic or genuine. So we can doubt as he goes through. This is these paragraphs. He begins with the things that are around us. Remember the things that we would have learned by those 4 other roads to knowledge, things that we would learn from other people, from our own sense experience, from our experimentation, anything from the senses and from outside of us. Those things are subjected to doubt, and since they are outside of us and depend on things outside of us about which we are not certain, those things or those beliefs too are not certain. So we've rejected them. So when he finally gets to paragraph 7, he has rejected the existence of an external world, the existence of a body. He has rejected even perhaps the idea of a God. He has rejected mathematical truths that would depend on memory, or insofar as they are not certain. So he's subjected absolutely everything to doubt and has rejected it. But here is where he discovers for the first time that the only thing that's left is his own self-consciousness. So he's rejected everything outside of himself, and now he's turned to his own thinking self. And here he discovers for the first time that he cannot doubt his existence while he is doubting. So to doubt, to say I am doubting, I have to say I am. To be, or to say I am, is to say that I exist. So I exist. When I say I am doubting, what I am really saying is I exist as doubting. So if I'm aware that I'm doubting, then I exist. So to doubt my own existence would be essentially by saying, I am doubting that I am, or I am doubting that I am doubting. That for him is a self-refuting claim, right? Because if it's true that you are doubting your existence, then you must exist. And if it's not true that you're doubting your existence, then you don't exist, but you're also not doubting your existence, actually. So in either case. So formulates that in this famous claim: "I think, therefore I am." Doubting is a form of thinking, right? All things that we would call perceiving, or everything of which we are aware, for Descartes is a thought, or is a mode of thought. Now, after that, read that we hence discover the distinction between the mind and the body, or between thinking and a corporeal thing. So also, while previously I told you that it's not only that there's a certain order in which we discover ideas in Descartes, but that order in which we discover ideas also reveals the true distinctions between those things of which they are ideas, if they're properly represented. Right. So the fact that Descartes is here going to take it that the fact that I can conceive of my own existence and be certain of it as a thinking being, while at the same time rejecting the existence even of physical things, let alone of all physical things, let alone of my body, means that I clearly and distinctly perceive a distinction between thinking and body, and my thinking, my idea of thinking, does not depend on the idea I have of body, and so thinking itself doesn't depend on body. You see that connection? Because I can conceive clearly and distinctly my thought while independently of my body, of any conception of my body, so my mind itself is independent or separate from my body. So this is the best mode of discovering the nature of the mind and its distinctness from the body. For examining what we are, while supposing, as we do, that there is nothing really existing apart from our thought, we clearly perceive that neither extension, nor figure, nor local motion, nor anything similar that can be attributed to body pertain to our nature, to our thought, to the nature of our thought, and nothing save thought alone, and consequently that the notion we have of our mind precedes that of any corporeal thing, and is more certain, seeing we still doubt whether there is any body in existence, while we already perceive that we think. In the Meditations, Descartes likes to put forward this point seemingly somewhat paradoxically, which is to say that we are more certain of our own souls than we are of the existence of tables and chairs and the things in the world. But now you can see why he would say that. Most people would say that's absurd. They don't even know if they have a soul. Well, for the first Descartes, by contrast, would say we know our souls before we even know bodies, and insofar as we know bodies, it depends upon a prior knowledge of our souls. Of course, part of the paradox there is because it disappears when you realize that by soul he means our own self-consciousness. And he's saying any consciousness we have of bodies outside of us would be impossible if we didn't first have consciousness of ourselves as thinking beings and of our own thoughts. That's not such a strange claim. Okay, how we can know our mind more clearly than our body. Same point, he's continuing there. In what sense the knowledge of other things depends upon the knowledge of God. Okay, so also previously when I was talking about Descartes, I explained that things do not depend on our minds, right? The existence of other things in the world do not depend on our minds. Obviously, they depend on whatever created the world, or in this case, because Descartes does believe in God, the existence of the world and of myself depends upon the existence of God. Now, we don't know at this point in the order of thinking that there even is a God, but we'll see what he says here. And the idea is going to be that I can know things outside of my mind because they depend on God once I know that God exists and can derive their existence from his existence. So, but when the mind, which thus knows itself, but is still in doubt as to other things, looks around on all sides with a view to farther extension of its knowledge, it first of all discovers within itself the ideas of many things, and while it simply contemplates them and neither affirms nor denies that there is anything beyond itself corresponding to them, it is in no danger of erring. So I have in my mind the idea of the desk in front of me, and he's saying I don't know whether there actually is a desk outside of my mind which corresponds to the idea in my mind of that desk. And as long as I don't assert that idea of a desk in my mind actually has a physical body outside of it, which causes that idea in my brain, as long as I don't make that assertion, I cannot be in error, because I am certain that I have the experience of a desk, but I'm not certain that there is a desk causing that experience outside of me. The mind also discovers certain notions out of which it frames various demonstrations that carry conviction to a degree as to render doubt of their truth impossible, so long as we give attention to them. For example, the mind has within itself the idea of numbers and figures, and it has likewise among its common notions the principle that if equals be added to equals, the whole will be equal, and the like, from which it is easy to demonstrate that 3 angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles. So here he's saying there are other ideas in our minds that are certain, insofar as we are aware when we are aware of them, right? As long as we give attention. Of course, if I no longer think about these principles, I'm not certain of them any longer. It's only in the moment, the very moment I have them before my mind, that I can be certain of them. And these are part of the basis of mathematics. Now, so long as we attend to the premises from which this conclusion and others similar to it were deduced, we feel assured of their truth. But as the mind cannot always think these with attention, when it has the remembrance of a conclusion without recollecting the order of its deduction, and is uncertain whether the author of its being has created it of a nature that it is liable to be deceived, even in what appears most evident, it perceives that there is just ground to distrust the truth of such conclusions, and that it cannot possess any certain knowledge until it has discovered its author. So, in essence, as long as mathematical demonstrations require any kind of memory in order to continue the derivation, to that extent, there's something not immediately before our minds that our knowledge depends on and is only in our memory. And if that's the case, then if we cannot trust our memory, and we cannot trust, as he says here, that the creator of our being has not created perhaps even a memory in us that is systematically deceiving us, until that point, until we can be assured of that, we can have no certain knowledge beyond those first immediate self-evident ideas. Okay, next, that we may validly infer the existence of God from necessary existence being comprised in the concept we have of him. Okay. So this is the first proof of God's existence, right? Moving very quickly. We found the first principle, and almost immediately we are moving to this first proof of God's existence. Now, he says here, we can infer the existence of God, so we prove the existence of God from necessary existence being comprised or contained in the concept of him. This is Descartes sometimes says that this is a geometrical proof, or a proof with geometrical certainty. Why? I'll explain that as follows. Oh, well, he actually says it here. But, well, okay, we might as well just read through it. When the mind afterwards reviews the different ideas that are in it, it discovers what is by far the chief among them, that of a being omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful, and absolutely perfect. And it observes that in this idea there is contained not only the possible and contingent existence, as in the ideas of all other things which it clearly perceives, but existence absolutely necessary and eternal. So the first step of the proof here is simply an examination of an idea that he says we all have in our minds. So look within yourself. Do you have the idea? He thinks that even in the self, without even asserting the existence of anything, if I ask myself, what is the concept of God? I do have a determinate concept of what God would be were he to exist. He would be a being that is omniscient, all-powerful, and absolutely perfect. Simply a concept I have, right, of that being. Now, this being, God, is omniscient, all-powerful, and absolutely perfect. Because it is an absolutely perfect being, the concept is also the concept of an existing being. This is the crux of the argument. To be absolutely perfect, something must exist. Another way of this is sometimes put is that God contains all perfections, intellect, will, all knowledge, all power, and so all goodness and so on. And among those perfections, existence itself is a perfection. And since God is the absolutely or the being with all perfections, God too must have existence. So the existence of God is contained in the very idea or concept we have of God. Consequently, Descartes is saying, contained in your very concept of a God is the existence of that being. That is proof that such a being exists. He says, and just as because, for example, the equality of its... Okay, this is why it's called a geometrical example. You and I, without asserting the existence of any triangle, can prove, using regular geometry, Euclidean geometry, prove that the interior angles are 180 degrees. Or as he says here, the interior angles of a triangle are equal to two right angles, right? 2 times 90, 180 degrees. So the interior angles of a triangle are always add up to 180 degrees in Euclidean geometry. We can prove that from the concept of a three-sided figure or a triangle. In the same way, he's saying, from the concept of God, you can prove that existence is a property of God, just as you can prove that 180 degrees is a property of a triangle, without asserting the existence of the triangle, and without first asserting the existence of God. The difference here is that 180 degrees is the property that is proven of a triangle geometrically, whereas the property that is proven of God is existence, because it's contained in his concept. So he says this existence is absolutely necessary. What that means, that means the existence is contained in the concept of it. You could not have a God, the concept of a God, without having the concept of existence as part of it. And so that existence is absolutely necessary. I can, however, and this is what he's talking about here with possible and contingent existence, I can have the concept of a triangle, and in no way can I logically prove from the concept of a triangle that a triangle exists. I can prove it has 180 degrees, I can prove many other things about it, but I cannot prove that it exists. Whether a triangle or a triangular object exists is merely possible and contingent, not necessary. The difference with God is I can prove many properties from the concept of God and also the property of existence. And so that existence is absolutely necessary. So that's the first proof of God's existence that Descartes gives. He says here that what I just explained, necessary existence is not contained in the ideas of other things. Here he's building up a second proof of God's existence. It starts here. That the greater objective perfection there is in our idea of a thing, the greater also must be the perfection of its cause. So this is a bit of a complicated proof, actually. It relies upon this principle that Descartes got from Aristotelian philosophy and metaphysics. And the argument is essentially this. We're not going to go into a great bit of detail here, but you can read this more carefully yourself, but let me try to make this a little bit plausible. So the premise, just as in the previous proof, is that we have a concept of God, right? It's in our mind, all-knowing, all-perfect, all these things. That is a clear and distinct idea that we all have. It's clear because being the most perfect being, we couldn't confuse it with the concepts of any other kinds of beings. And it's distinct because the concept of God is of the most simple being, right? And all his perfections are identical with each other. This is part of natural theology of the time. And so by its nature, the concept of God is one of the simplest concepts. It is perhaps the simplest concept. And we know exactly what it is. We have a clear and distinct idea of it. distinct idea of it. And the question Descartes raises here is, how can we have such an idea? Could our minds be the source of that idea? Or, and this is what he will argue, is it the case that this idea is such that the only way it could have gotten into our minds is if God himself had placed it there? Well, how would you prove that? Well, you would have to have a principle like this, that any idea that's in my mind must have been produced by something that is at least as perfect and as great as the being is that's an idea of. Maybe I put that right. So let me give an example to make it clearer. If I have the idea of a table in my mind, then whatever produced the idea of the table, according to Descartes, whatever real thing outside of my mind or maybe in my mind produced that idea, it must be as complicated and perfect and great as that idea is, and even as what is represented in that idea. So what do I represent in that idea? I represent a table. So there must be something in the universe at least as perfect and great as a table from which that representation was generated. Now, it doesn't have to be from a table. Could be that my soul has the power to produce the representation of a table. But in order for it to be able to produce the representation of a table, it must contain at least as much what he calls objective reality, I called it complexity and greatness, as a table does, or as a table would if a table existed. Because a table could have produced that idea in me. That would be the most obvious possibility. But maybe my mind did, but if it did, then my mind must be at least as great as a table. That doesn't sound too persuasive, maybe. But here's another example. Descartes says in one case where he's trying to explain this, think of a complex machine. You have an idea that you might have in your mind of a very complex machine. Now, whatever produced that idea in you, it could have been that you examined such a machine, and then that machine produced the idea in you, and the complexity that's represented in your idea of the machine is a result of the complexity of the machine itself. Okay. Say, fine, that seems plausible. Now, something else might have produced the idea of that machine in my mind. For instance, someone told me about the machine. Then you would say, well, whatever complexity is present in that representation in my mind of a machine, well, what they described to me, their description itself must have been at least as complicated and complex as the idea of the machine that they gave me, right? Unless I added something myself. And so there's always, every idea, there seems to be something that exists that has as much complexity as is contained in the idea that it produced. This is the idea that Descartes has. Here he calls this objective perfection, or sometimes objective reality. And he says that the principle is that the greater the objective perfection, the complexity I called it, there is in our idea of a thing, the greater also must be the perfection in the cause of that thing. Right? Now, since we have the idea of God, and God is the idea of the greatest, most perfect being, there must be something that produced that idea that is equally great. And of course, our minds are not that great, are not all perfect, all knowing, and so on. And so our mind could not have produced this idea in us, if it's a genuine idea. And so something else must have done that. And he says, well, the only thing that would be suitable, the only thing that would be great enough to produce such an idea in us is God, is an actual, real existing God. So God exists. Still, you may be very skeptical about this principle that he's using, and I understand that entirely. I would say, however, sometimes we use this kind of principle ourselves. Let me take a case from, for instance, plagiarism. If someone were to turn into me, and this has happened many times, They turn in a paper to me that I judge. I read the paper and I say this paper is very good. It's very intelligent. It's very complex. It's got certain qualities about it. It's well structured, and I know that something structured that paper, created that complexity and those ideas. And then I look at the student who turned it in, and I realize their mind was not great enough to have created the complexity that is present in the paper. And so I judge there must exist a mind somewhere that was great enough to create such a paper. It's not this mind. So this mind must have gotten the idea of the paper from another mind, right? That was great enough to give it the concept. So there's kind of a humorous example where, yes, we kind of make this idea or use this idea to infer the existence of someone else than the person who represented the concept. It's a very common sense idea in a certain way. So next, after he's proven God's existence, he has to prove, he wants to prove the properties of God, right? What are all the perfections of God? So now we know that we exist and we know that God exists. Well, what kind of God exists? God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-perfect. Because he's all-perfect, he's all good. And Descartes argues that, okay, now we can get rid of one of the key fantasies we had come up with in order to doubt all things. Namely, we were able to doubt all things. One of the strongest hypotheses that made us doubt even the most obvious things is the hypothesis that perhaps there is some great being who deceives us, right? An evil demon or something. We didn't talk about this much, but this is one of the hypotheses. And so if we know God exists now, and we know that God created us, and we know that he's good, goodness is inconsistent, Descartes argues, with being a deceiver. So God is not a deceiver. So not only is God not systematically deceiving our memories or anything like that, he's also didn't create us in a way that we will systematically deceive ourselves if we at least follow the proper method, right? So many of the things that seem most evident to us must therefore be true of the world outside of us, because otherwise God would be a deceiver. Again, another proof of God's existence, a third one. We know all his attributes. And passing from knowledge of God to the knowledge of creatures, it is necessary to remember that our understanding is finite and the power of God is infinite. Again, now that we have some certainty and knowledge back, of course, Descartes is, at every turn when he does this, he'll then remind us that, yet nevertheless, our understanding is finite and God's is infinite, right? This is one of his constant things that he does to try to keep out of trouble. That we must believe all that God has revealed. So again, deference to revelation. He does that in 2. Notice it follows immediately after the claim that we can have some certainty. That we must examine not the final but the efficient causes of created things. So this is a bit like we saw in Alexander Pope and in Giordano Bruno, that God's ends or purposes in the world are far beyond anything that we could comprehend. So we must stick to efficient causes, to physics, right? Do not mix in teleology or consideration of divine purposes with physics. Although there are divine purposes, they're just beyond our knowledge. God is not the cause of our errors. Why? Because we freely, whenever we make an error. So God has, let me go back a little bit. God is not the cause of our errors, he argues, because God created us. He doesn't deceive us. So when we do create errors or assert things that are wrong, it must be because we are misapplying the powers that God gave us, right? And in particular, we can do that because we are free. So we can assent to things that we do not clearly and distinctly perceive, right? That consequently, all we clearly perceive is true, right? Since clear perception is the closest key we have to truth, and that also he derived clear perception of an idea from this idea of I think, therefore I am. When we only assert what is we clearly perceive, then we assert what is true, right? And there we can be delivered from doubt. Let's see what else is interesting here. Two modes of our thinking, two major kind of aspects of thinking, understanding and will, right? That we never err unless when we judge of something which we do not sufficiently apprehend. So if you follow your best lights, you follow the tools that God gave you to know the truth, namely clear and distinct perception, and you only judge what you clearly and distinctly perceive to be true, then you cannot possibly fall into error. We never err except when we judge that which we do not sufficiently apprehend. That the will as well as the understanding is required for judging. So this is this idea he has that when you judge, when I assert something as true, I don't just represent it, right? So go back to that idea of a machine, a complex machine. In just having the idea of a complex machine in my mind, that idea by itself cannot be true or false because there's nothing being asserted there. There may be no such machine, but I'm not just by having the idea in my mind, I'm not asserting that such a machine exists outside of my mind. So to do that, I must have the idea and represent in the understanding, and in addition, I must make a judgment. Judgment is kind of like a mental statement. So I have to say, for instance, I have the idea of a complex machine, and that complex machine is here in front of me now, right, in the world. When I do that, I have created a judgment, and then I can make an error. So judgment requires asserting something. That's an act of willing. So it's not just the mind as representing or as understanding or intellect that asserts things to be true or false. It requires an act of the will. Of course, not an act of the will in performing an external action, but a mental action, right? An action of judging or of asserting. That's what he's saying here. So judging requires both understanding and will. Now the will is of greater extension than the understanding, and thus is the source of our errors. So I can represent a machine, a complex machine in my mind, and I can represent the concept that machine will lift a 300-pound car. And I can connect those things together in a judgment and say, this machine will lift a 300-pound car, right? Now, when I do that it will lift a 300-pound car may not be something that I've ever proven scientifically. It's just something I have asserted, right? I have these two concepts of a machine and of lifting a 300-pound car, and I say, this machine will do that. I understand, I represent this, and there's no mistake there. I represent this, and there can be no mistake there. But then when I connect them together, maybe I don't clearly represent that connection. There my will goes beyond what I understand and makes an assertion that goes beyond clear and distinct perception, and therefore can be false. And whenever we make any judgment, it's that way, and thus all error originates from our own will. So we cannot, as he says next, we cannot impute our errors to God. God is not responsible for them. Nevertheless, you'd say, well, then wouldn't it be better if God didn't create us with a free will so that we could fall into error? And he argues, no, that is not in fact true. If God were to take away our free will, he would take away that thing that is most divine in us and most like God and most perfect. So with that perfection comes the ability to error, right? That we'll never err if we give our assent only to what we clearly and distinctly perceive. We understand that now. That we uniformly judge improperly when we assent to what we do not clearly perceive. Okay. Although our judgment may chance to be true. It may be true by accident, but it's not true because we know it to be true. And that it is frequently our memory which deceives us by leading us to believe that certain things were formerly sufficiently understood by us. What constitutes clear and distinct perception? I explained this in class a little bit. He gives some examples of clear and distinct representations. You can have representations that are clear but not distinct. So remember, clarity has to do with not kind of mixing it up with any other ideas that we may have. It's very vivid in our minds, such that we can distinguish it from others. Whereas distinctness has to do with knowing its internal constitution, its parts, maybe its causes. So for instance, an example of a very clear but not distinct, and confused is the opposite of distinct, confused and clear but clear idea is that of intense pain. We're not going to mix up pain with anything else, with pleasure, with flavor, with our own existence, nothing. It's very clear. But what is pain? What does it depend on? What produces it? This we have no idea of. So it is very confused or indistinct. So what do we distinctly represent? Not surprisingly, it is mathematical notions. Duration, order, number may be distinctly conceived. But secondary qualities, taste, hardness, sound, and so on, colors, these are not pain. These are not distinctly conceived, right? So mathematics is what's only although sensible ideas, secondary qualities can be very clear, they are not clear and distinct and cannot be clear and distinct. Whereas mathematical things can be both clear and distinct. So notice this means that however you've got you can see how this has all come together now. We know the truth if we follow and judge according to our clear and distinct ideas. The only clear and distinct ideas we really have are mathematical concepts and notions. And we had that other principle that how we clearly and distinctly represent things is how things really are in the world outside of us, because God would not create us such that the things that seem most true to us are not true. Therefore, the world itself, and God created the world according to duration, order, and number. God created the world as a physicist, as a mathematical physicist. Right? Okay, this is back to the distinction between the soul and the body. We can skip that. This too, that we are frequently deceived in our judgments regarding pain. Again, this is kind of pointing out things like pain, which are not distinctly. God doesn't deceive us when he's telling us something that looks to be true, right? In other words, God would be deceiving us if our clear and distinct ideas did not represent reality. But if our confused ideas somehow lead us astray, or we judge about our confused ideas, and that leads us into error, then it's not God deceiving us, although we can be deceived. You may feel, you may have a leg missing, right? This is a famous example of phantom pain. Someone has a limb amputated and they feel pain where there is none in the leg. In a way, you might think, well, is God not deceiving me? Because God is allowing me to have pain in a thing that is located in space where there is no part of my physical body, so that pain is not real pain. It's apparent pain. And Descartes says, no, absolutely not. God is not a deceiver, because things like pain do not represent themselves to us in a way that they could be clear and distinct. And so we should not judge. When I feel that pain, I should never judge that pain is coming from that leg. Because I don't clearly represent that. And so I shouldn't make any judgment regarding it. And then I wouldn't fall into error. Again, that magnitude, figure, etc., mathematical qualities, are known far differently from color, pain, etc., from secondary qualities. Namely, these are known clearly and distinctly, and these are known clearly, perhaps obscurely as well, but never distinctly. Chief cause of our errors is to be found in the prejudice of our childhood. We talked about this. Just like Bacon, he believes prejudices are one of the main sources of error. So prejudices lead us to use our will to make judgments when our intellect has not clearly and distinctly perceived that about which we judge. That the cause of our errors is that we cannot forget these prejudices, right? These prejudices are deep within us. The third cause is that we become fatigued by attending to those objects which are not present to the senses. So also, I said, Descartes talks about how these mental actions of clear and distinct representation, always examining something but in your own mind, is very exhausting. And this can be a source of error. It's too difficult. We just want the truth, right? We want to skip immediately to making judgments and coming to conclusions. The fourth source of our errors is that we attach our thoughts to words which do not express them with accuracy. This is Bacon, right? Idol of the marketplace. Notice here, just like Bacon had a special part of his method that dealt with the errors, right? The idols. And here Descartes is taking us through 4 different kinds of idols, sources of error, and some of them are very, very similar. Why? Why are they similar? Because Descartes and Bacon are both, to a certain extent, diagnosing these errors based upon the characteristics of the philosophy that preceded them that was wrong. So they believe, for instance, that the medieval and Aristotelian philosophers used words that were not well formed to represent truth. They both think this, and so these are among the errors they're going to talk about. The attachment to Aristotle, the difficulty of thinking, the prejudices. What prejudices does he mean? He means prejudices that we get from our education, from the people around us, from our own inclinations, right? Idols of the cave, idols of the and so on, right? Here you can read through this nice summary. This is a very nice one. You should probably read through it. It kind of goes through all that has been said up to this point and says, but then connects this with, this is all about the order of philosophizing correctly, right? The order, this is where the order arises, because this order shows that we should start with the things that we clearly and distinctly perceive most easily and most evidently, and then move on to prove everything else from them. And thereby those things become clear and distinct as well, and we slowly expand our knowledge according to the proper order. But we can only do that if we move incrementally, such that each chain in the argument leads to the next, and we don't make any leaps by virtue of judging what we don't clearly and distinctly perceive, right? And thereby breaking the order. Now that he has summarized the principle by which philosophy reaches certainty, again, we see it. This is so typical of Descartes, that we ought to prefer the divine authority to our own perception, but that, apart from things revealed, we ought to assent to nothing that we do not clearly apprehend. So he's kind of making carving out a little place for deference to the church here, saying, if anything is revealed, it trumps everything I've said, and we should let divine authority, although divine authority, he's given no explanation in this book whatsoever why divine authority does not belong to those things that you can doubt, right? Why, if I can doubt what's in Aristotle or in any book or what anyone tells me, why should I not doubt what's in the Bible? How can I be more certain that what's in the Bible is true revelation rather than anything else? Why would I believe priests who tell me that there is a God? They are just like other people. This just springs naturally to the mind, and obviously it must have been in Descartes' mind. Nevertheless, divine authority we should trust beyond our own personal perception of things. And then he says, but in everything else, my method is the correct method. Now we feel there's a tension here because his method is based upon this proof of God's existence, or something that's supposed to be certain. It goes back to the first principle of certainty, and nowhere did a divine authority enter into the order. It shouldn't be here in the order of thoughts because there's no point for it to have come in at any point. So view that how you might, but likely there's a great deal of it's hard to say. whether Descartes was of one clear view on this or not. Now, this is part 2 of the principles, and now we move immediately to physics, the principles of material things. The grounds on which the existence of material things may be known with certainty, right? With certainty. The perceptions of the senses do not teach us what is in reality in things, but what is beneficial or hurtful to the composite of the whole mind and body. So as I said, what he means by the perceptions of the senses here, he means secondary qualities, the non-mathematical qualities. And he's saying here, these do not teach us about the reality in things, but they only give us a kind of shortcut to knowing whether that thing is beneficial or harmful to our life, the composite of our mind and body, right? Now, you say, where does bodies come from? Well, one of Descartes' arguments, remember, we proved God's existence and proved that God would not be a deceiver, and Descartes argues that the existence of an external world is so seemingly evident to us that if there was no external world, then God would have to be a deceiver. So there must be an external world, and with that there must be a body. I must have a body after all. Now he's saying, why do things taste good? Well, it's not because taste is in the world out there. It's not in the apple, the flavor. The flavor is only in your mind. And for some reason, when you experience and your body interacts with that apple and its particles go into you, suddenly in your soul there is produced this strange sensation of apple flavor. Why is that? Well, again, it's not because the apple flavor is in the world or is any way related to the structure of your tongue or anything like that. It's because God associated in your soul these motions of the body so that to give you kind of shortcut. It tastes good, so you eat it. It tastes good and it's healthy. And so that helps preserve your life. While you're growing up as a child and so on, you couldn't always come to study the apple to see that whether it is truly healthy or not. You had to follow the hints of secondary qualities, and that's why they're there. It's a very strange idea. That the nature of body consists not in weight, hardness, color, and the like. These are, for him, secondary qualities, but an extension alone. So the nature of body. What is a body? A body has no color, has no hardness, has nothing like this. It has only extension, right? Length, width, breadth. That's all it has. That's what bodies consist of. Extension. It's like congealed mathematics. That the truth regarding the nature of bodies obscured by opinions respecting rarefaction and a vacuum. Remember, he doesn't believe in a vacuum. In fact, he doesn't think there's anything as empty space. All that empty space is an idea we have, an abstraction from physical nature, and in particular from physical nature, where the bodies that fill that void, or what's not a void, but that fills nature, are very light and very small and can be moved very easily, such that we don't notice them with our rough senses, and so we presume that space to be empty. Explanation of rarefaction, namely like expansion, if there's no void, what happens when air, for instance, warms up and expands, or anything like that. He's got to explain that. You can read that in more detail. Okay, let's go a bit further. How space is not in reality different from corporeal substance. So remember, he said bodies simply are extension, right? So space is not really different from physical substance. They are one and the same thing. What space is as a mathematical concept is an abstraction in our minds from our representation of corporeal substance, or bodily, right? Like corpse, corporeal. That's just another way of saying bodily substance. Let's read this one. And indeed it will be easy to discern that it is the same extension which constitutes the nature of body as of space, and that these two things are mutually diverse only as the nature of the genus and species differ from that of the individual, provided we reflect on the idea we have of any body, taking a stone for example, and reject all that is not essential to the nature of body. So it sounds a bit complicated, but what he's really saying here is, say for instance you have a rock, you reflect upon that rock, and you leave out hardness and all other secondary qualities. And then you are left with the space, or what we call the space, that the rock occupies. And so your idea of that space arises from abstraction from that body. But that space is not a real thing, separate from that body. It's the representation in the mind of the space of the extension of that body minus its other qualities. In the first place, then, hardness we may reject, because if the stone were liquefied or reduced to powder, it would no longer possess hardness, and yet would not cease to be a body. Color also may be thrown out of account, because we have frequently seen stones so transparent as to have no color. Again, we may reject weight, because we have the case of fire, which, though very light, is still a body. And finally, we may reject cold, heat, and all the other qualities of the sort, either because they are not considered in the stone, or because with the change of these qualities, the stone is not supposed to have lost the nature of body. After this examination, we will find that nothing remains in the idea of body except that it is something extended in length, breadth, and depth. And this something is comprised in our idea of space, not only of that which is full of body, but even of what is called void space. So we can, because bodies, this is the put this in his general method, remember, clear and distinct perception, saying we can see that the body is nothing but extension because we can clearly and distinctly represent body while rejecting its secondary qualities, right? We can represent a body that is transparent and has no color. We can represent a body that is neither cold nor hot nor of any of those qualities. And since we can clearly still represent body as such without those ideas, body truly is distinct from those ideas, and those ideas are not contained in that of body. And that is what we generally call space as well. Space differs from body only in our mode of conceiving it, only in the way we represent it in our mind. I think we're about finished. You can read through all of these. This is his attempt to take his method and some of his basic ideas and to apply it to the basis of physics, right? It also follows that the matter of the heavens and the earth is the same, and that there cannot be a plurality of worlds. That all the variety of matter, or the diversity of its forms, depends on motion, because all bodies are as extension. The only difference between them, portions of space, can be in their motions, not in other things like hardness or whatever, because those don't really belong to it. The only thing that truly belongs to those is motion. Of the visible world, that we ought to beware lest in our presumption we imagine that the ends which God proposed to himself in creation of the world are understood by us. Again, rejecting this idea that we can comprehend God's purposes. In what sense it may be said that all things were created for the sake of man. For although, as far as regards morals, it may be a pious thought to believe that God made all things for us, seeing that we may thus be incited to greater gratitude and love towards him, and that although it is even in some sense true, because there is no created thing of which we cannot make some use, if it be only that of exercising the mind when considerate, and honoring God on account of it, it is yet by no means probable that all things were created for us, in this way that God had no other end in their creation. Sounds like Alexander Pope later, right? It's not as extensive. It also sounds a bit like Bruno, but it's not as radical. But it's still saying that the universe is not created for God, but for, and from our knowledge of the universe, it seems probable, or improbable that they were created for us, so probable that they were not, and that God had purposes beyond us. And this supposition would be plainly ridiculous and inept in physical reasoning. So don't use consideration of divine purposes in physics. Part 4 of the Earth, that there is no phenomenon of nature whose explanation has been omitted in this treatise. No phenomenon of nature that he cannot explain in this treatise that he is presenting to us on the principles that he has given. The sensible bodies are composed of insensible particles. This is atomism. Okay. I'll let you read the rest of this. Just to make a comment on this very last one again. Again, at the end of this part, Descartes periodically returns to this point about giving deference to the church. That, however, I submit all my opinions to the authority of the church. Nevertheless, lest I should presume too far, I am affirming nothing, but submit all these opinions to the authority of the church and the judgment of the more sage. And I desire no one to believe anything I may have said, unless he is constrained to admit it by the force and evidence of reason. So make of that what you will. Certainly Descartes is not as bold as Bruno was, certainly not as bold as Galileo was. And to a certain extent, that it seems that was the right strategy. His works were somewhat resisted by the church all along, but he certainly gained much more widespread acclaim in his own time than Bruno ever did, and to a certain extent Galileo as well. Although Galileo was still held by many to be kind of a champion and the genius of the physical sciences, even towards the end of his life. Okay, on to the next video.